barely made ends meet. After her husband's death, the widow decided to clean out the old attic and stumbled upon a dusty box, thinking it contained ordinary junk. But what she found inside changed her life forever. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The house was heavy with silence, a silence that seemed to carry weight, pressing down on the walls, the floors, even on the breath of the woman who wandered through it like a ghost. Lillian moved slowly from room to room, her hands brushing along the furniture that once bore the fingerprints of another pair of hands, the hands she had known and loved for so many years. Now, those hands were gone, buried in the earth, and the house that once felt alive and warm had become a tomb echoing with memories. She had never imagined that death could steal not only a man's body but also the light of a home. She sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before she thought to drink it. The liquid was dark and bitter, much like the weeks that had passed since the funeral. The smell of his aftershave still lingered faintly in the hallway, woven into the fabric of his jackets that hung untouched in the closet. Sometimes she caught herself turning her head, expecting to hear his footsteps on the stairs or the sound of his voice calling from the next room. The realization that those sounds would never return was like a knife, sharp and merciless, cutting her all over again each day. The bills piled high on the kitchen counter, sealed envelopes with urgent red letters that seemed to glare at her whenever she looked their way. Electricity, gas, water, medical debts, each one a reminder of the life she had once shared with her husband, a life held together by his steady work and his belief that somehow things would always be all right. Now, she alone bore the burden, and the weight was crushing her. The few dollars she counted in her worn wallet were barely enough to cover a week's groceries. She knew the utility company would soon cut the power if she didn't pay, and the very thought of darkness settling over the already somber house filled her with dread. Her body carried the exhaustion of grief, but it was not only grief that wore her down. Hunger gnawed at her, the stress of debt hollowed her, and the thought of losing the home she had shared with him left her trembling. She had once found safety in these walls, but now she felt as though the house itself might betray her, slipping from her grasp if she could not pay for it. At night, when the loneliness was most unbearable, she lay awake listening to the creak of the old floorboards and the sigh of the wind pressing against the windows. The darkness seemed alive, whispering that she was powerless, that nothing she did would be enough. But Lillian was not entirely powerless, not yet. Somewhere beneath her despair, a spark of determination still flickered. She thought of her children, of the promises she had whispered to them after the funeral, when their small faces looked to her for strength she barely had. She had told them they would keep the house, that they would not be forced to leave behind the rooms that held their laughter, their father's memory, the only sense of home they had left. To keep that promise, she would have to find a way to bring in money, no matter how little, no matter how humiliating it felt to strip the house of its belongings. Her eyes lifted to the ceiling, to the square outline of the attic hatch. For years, that hatch had remained closed, a forgotten door to a space that had long ago been sealed with dust and silence. Her husband had rarely spoken of the attic, except to say that it was full of things they didn't need, but that he didn't want to throw away. She had never questioned him. He was the sort of man who held on to objects with quiet reverence, storing away the past as though one day it might prove important. Now, with his absence like an open wound, the thought of climbing into that space stirred something within her. She pictured the attic as it might be. Boxes stacked high, forgotten furniture, relics of years that had passed without notice. Perhaps there were things up there she could sell at a garage sale, things that neighbors might pay a few dollars for. Even if the money was small, it could buy food, keep the lights on a little longer. Every penny mattered now. She imagined herself standing outside on the driveway, setting up tables with books and dishes and clothes, calling out to passers-by. The image was both humiliating and strangely hopeful, for at least it was a plan. At least it meant she would be doing something instead of drowning in sorrow. Her gaze lingered on the hatch as though it were alive, a secret mouth that had never spoken. Dust lined the edges, and the wooden frame had darkened with time. She remembered how her husband had sometimes come down from there with boxes in his arms, his shirt streaked with dust, his face unreadable. He never said much about what he had been doing, only that he was looking for something or putting something away. At the time, she hadn't cared to ask, too busy with the endless rhythm of life. But now she wished she had. A sudden chill crept through her as she stood in the kitchen staring upward. She wondered if climbing into the attic would feel like trespassing into his private world, a world he had guarded without ever explaining why. But necessity overpowered hesitation. She could no longer afford to honor the mystery of the attic. If there was even the smallest chance that it held something useful, she would have to open it. Slowly, she pulled a chair beneath the hatch and climbed onto it, the wood creaking under her weight. Her hands shook as she reached for the string that dangled from the door. It felt strange to touch it, as though she were touching a part of him, a piece of the life he had kept hidden. For a long moment, she hesitated, her heart thudding in her chest. She imagined him standing behind her, watching, perhaps even disapproving. But then she closed her eyes, whispered his name under her breath, and pulled the string. The hatch gave way with a groan, sending a thin cloud of dust down into her face. She coughed, blinking back tears as she steadied herself. A wooden ladder unfolded slowly, its hinges creaking like the joints of an old man. The smell of stale air drifted down, dry and thick with the scent of time. She stared into the black rectangle above her, into the unknown space that had waited silently for years. For the first time since his death, Lillian felt something stir inside her that was not grief, not despair, but something closer to anticipation. It was a fragile spark, barely more than a breath, but it was there. She stepped onto the ladder, the rungs rough against her hands, and began to climb into the shadows. The attic awaited her, filled with the ghosts of her husband's past, filled with the remnants of lives lived and forgotten. She did not know what she would find, whether it would be useless junk or something that might save her from the edge of ruin. But she knew one thing. Once she opened the door to the attic, there would be no turning back. And so she climbed, one step at a time, carrying with her the weight of sorrow and the faint, trembling hope that in the dust of the past she might find a way forward. The air grew heavier as Lillian's head rose above the wooden frame, and she pulled herself into the attic. For a moment, she stayed crouched, blinking into the dimness that swallowed her whole. The faint light from the narrow window at the far end barely pierced the gloom, only enough to reveal shifting motes of dust that danced in the beam like restless spirits. The space smelled of age, a mixture of dried wood, moth-eaten cloth, and the stale perfume of objects that had been sealed away for decades. It was as though the attic had trapped time itself, keeping it pressed into every box and trunk that lined the uneven floorboards. She sat back on her heels and let her eyes adjust, her breath still uneven from the climb. Beneath her, the house lay silent, the rooms below heavy with the absence of her husband. But here above them was another silence, older, thicker, more intimate. It seemed almost intrusive to disturb it, yet necessity had hardened her resolve. She pulled the ladder up behind her, unwilling to let the cold draft of the house spoil this sealed chamber, and began moving cautiously between the stacks of things. The boxes came first. They were arranged in irregular towers, some bound with twine that had frayed with age, others sealed with brittle tape that cracked at the edges. She placed her hand on the first one and felt the rough surface of the cardboard, soft and almost damp from years of disuse. She opened it slowly, wincing as though expecting something to leap from within, but inside there were only children's toys, worn smooth from play. Small wooden cars, a stuffed bear with one button eye missing, and a jumble of plastic figurines that bore the bright colors of another era. She traced her fingers across them, remembering her husband's childhood stories, the way his eyes softened when he spoke of the years before hardship bent his back. Moving to another box, she uncovered stacks of newspapers. Their edges had curled inward, the ink faded to a sepia blur, but she could still make out the dates, decades old. Headlines shouted about wars, elections, parades, and scandals long forgotten by most of the world. She lifted one carefully, the paper threatening to crumble under its own weight, and stared at the image of a smiling president waving from a convertible. How many times had her husband stood in this very space and thumbed through these relics, unwilling to throw them away? She could almost see him here, hunched over the yellowed pages, inhaling the past like it gave him strength. Each discovery seemed to tug at her heart in different ways. Old coats hung from nails hammered into the beams, their sleeves stiff with dust, their shapes sagging like shadows of the men who once wore them. There were boxes of kitchenware, pots and pans dented from use, tarnished silver utensils tangled in cloths that smelled faintly of smoke. She opened a suitcase and found stacks of letters tied with ribbon, the handwriting lupin and familiar. Some were addressed to her husband in his youth, notes from friends, letters from family long gone. She sat cross-legged and read a few, feeling the inked voices of strangers reach across decades. But it was not all nostalgia. Some items carried a chill. A broken clock with its hands frozen at midnight sat atop a crate, as though marking the end of some forgotten moment. A cracked mirror leaned against the wall, its surface clouded so heavily that her reflection appeared as a ghost, her eyes wide and lost. She moved quickly past it, shivering, unwilling to linger in the distorted image of herself. Time stretched as she worked her way deeper into the attic. Each box was another fragment of her husband's secret world, a world she had never been fully invited into. She began to realize just how much he had carried alone, how many memories and keepsakes he had preserved without explanation. Perhaps he had thought to protect her from the weight of the past, or perhaps he had simply been a man who found comfort in objects. Whatever the reason, it struck her with a kind of sorrow that he had locked so much of himself away here. In the farthest corner, the light barely reached. Dust lay thicker there, as though no hand had disturbed it for years. Her knees creaked as she crouched down and brushed away cobwebs, her fingers trembling slightly. That was when she saw it. A wooden trunk, heavy and scarred, pushed back against the sloping wall. Unlike the other boxes, it bore no markings of use. The metal latch was rusted but still strong, the lid stained with age. Something about its placement, hidden in the dark, stirred her curiosity more than anything she had yet uncovered. She tugged at the trunk and found it resistant, as though it had grown into the floor itself. With effort, she dragged it forward, coughing as a fresh cloud of dust swirled up. Her hands hovered over the latch. A strange unease filled her chest. She thought again of her husband, the way he sometimes returned from the attic with dust in his hair and a secret smile, saying nothing of what he had been doing. Could it have been this trunk he had visited? What had he hidden here that was worth such secrecy? Her fingers closed around the latch and forced it open. The sound of metal giving way echoed through the still attic like a door creaking in an abandoned church. She lifted the lid and leaned over. Inside, under layers of cloth and paper, rested something entirely different from the toys and books and relics she had unearthed. The first glimpse showed her polished wood, unusual in shape, and the faint glint of metal keys. She pulled back more cloth and found herself staring at a machine, boxy and archaic, wires and circuits exposed. A small emblem was stamped onto the surface, the image of an apple, half bitten. Her brow furrowed as she brushed more dust away. The words "Apple Computer" appeared in faded print across the top. She had never seen anything like it before. At first glance, it looked like the husk of an old typewriter married to the guts of a radio, something impossibly outdated. She shifted her weight and pulled free a sheaf of papers tucked alongside it. The top page bore a date, 1976. Beneath that, diagrams and instructions typed carefully as though from another age. Lillian sat back on her heels, her heart quickening. The attic seemed suddenly closer, the air pressing against her as though aware of her discovery. She tried to imagine her husband here, gently placing this strange contraption into the trunk, covering it as though protecting a secret. Why had he never told her about it? Why hide it at all? She knew nothing about computers beyond the small device her daughter used for schoolwork, sleek and modern, glowing with color. This wooden box with its primitive guts could not compare. To her, it seemed more a relic, a curiosity that might amuse someone at a flea market. Yet something about the care with which it had been stored gave her pause. She ran her fingers across the wood, feeling the grooves of age, the roughness of the grain. It was not like the other things, tossed aside and forgotten. This had been placed here deliberately, hidden with intention. A weight of mystery clung to it, and though she did not yet understand, she sensed it meant more than its appearance suggested. Still, practical thoughts pressed in. Bills waited on the table downstairs. Hunger gnawed at her children's bellies. She could not afford to let sentiment slow her. Even if this machine was nothing more than scrap, it could fetch a few dollars. Some collector of oddities might see value in its strangeness. $50, maybe $100, enough for groceries, enough to keep the lights burning for another month. She closed the trunk again, dust puffing into her face, and sat there for a long time listening to the creaks of the old house. Her husband's shadow hung over the attic, silent and watchful. She felt almost as though she had intruded on something sacred, yet necessity hardened her once more. The machine would go downstairs, and if someone wanted it, they could have it. She could not allow herself to wonder if it meant something greater. She was a woman fighting for survival, and survival demanded sacrifice. Gathering her strength, she wrapped the object in its old cloth and lifted it from the trunk. It was heavier than she expected, awkward to carry, but she held it tight against her chest and made her way back toward the ladder. The attic seemed to sigh around her, as though it understood what she had taken, as though it mourned the end of its long vigil. She did not look back. She only descended slowly, step by careful step, into the dark silence of the house below. The discovery sat heavy in her arms, heavier in her mind. She did not yet know what it meant. only that it was the first object she had found that felt different, purposeful, like a secret her husband had intended for her to uncover. She carried it down into the kitchen and placed it on the table, brushing her hands across the cloth as if to reassure herself it was real. The bills still glared at her from the counter, but for the first time, she felt something stir beyond despair. Perhaps, hidden in the dust of forgotten trunks, her husband had left her more than memories. Perhaps he had left her a chance. Lillian kept the cloth-wrapped object on the kitchen table for the rest of the evening, unable to decide what to do with it. The trunk had been so heavy, so firmly wedged into the floorboards of the attic, that carrying it down felt like removing a stone from the foundation of the house. Now it sat there before her in the half-light of a single lamp, silent and inscrutable, daring her to uncover its meaning. She had thought she would feel relief at finding something she might sell, but instead she was unsettled, restless, as though the thing itself demanded her attention. When she finally gathered the courage, she pulled away the faded cloth, letting the air of the kitchen wash over the strange machine. The wooden casing was smoother than she had noticed before, though the varnish had dulled and the edges showed the marks of time. The wires coiled across the surface looked crude, like veins exposed beneath thin skin. Keys lined the edge in a blocky formation, their plastic surfaces yellowed but intact. And there, almost lost against the grain of the wood, was the emblem she had seen in the attic. An apple with a bite taken from its side. It was such a simple design, almost childish, yet it caught her attention in a way she could not explain. Beside the machine lay the sheaf of papers she had pulled from the trunk. She smoothed one out on the table, tracing the typed words with her fingertip. The language was foreign to her, filled with diagrams, numbers, and technical jargon she could not understand. But the date stamped in the corner was clear enough, 1976. Her mind balked at the number. Almost half a century had passed since then. Could this thing truly have survived so long, hidden away like a secret relic? She tried to imagine her husband the day he carried it into the attic. He must have been younger then, perhaps not even married to her yet, his face unlined by worry. Had it been given to him, bought in some strange trade? Or had he stumbled across it by chance, recognizing its importance in a way she never could? He had never been a man of wealth, nor one for extravagance. His treasures had always been small things, family photographs, letters, and worn tools he kept long after they broke. Why then would he protect this machine as though it were more precious than all the rest? A wave of weariness washed over her as she leaned back, staring at the bills still spread across the counter. Their presence mocked her, pressing the weight of reality back into her thoughts. It did not matter how unusual or mysterious the machine looked. To her, it was just another object in a house cluttered with memories, and memories could not feed her children or keep the lights on. If she could sell it, then perhaps it would prove useful. If not, then it was no better than the broken clocks or yellowed newspapers she had already sifted through. Still, she could not deny the feeling that lingered, a quiet whisper of importance that clung to the artifact. When she finally rose and carried it into the living room, she set it carefully on the old coffee table, almost reverently, as though afraid it might shatter if treated roughly. She covered it again with the cloth, unable to bear the strange pull of its presence, and sank into the sofa with her face buried in her hands. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the creaks of the old beams above, the shifting silence that seemed to swell and retreat around her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the machine again, its emblem glowing faintly in the dark. She dreamt of her husband as he had been when she first met him, full of restless energy, always tinkering with something, his hands deft and sure. In the dream, he stood in the attic, bent over the strange contraption, his face lit with quiet pride. When she tried to call to him, he only smiled and faded into the shadows. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the ache of loss sharper than ever. Morning brought no answers. The children stirred restlessly, asking about breakfast, and she made do with what little was left in the cupboards. They did not ask about the cloth-covered bundle in the living room, though one of them glanced at it curiously before hurrying off to school. Lillian herself avoided looking at it, instead focusing on the tasks of the day. But when the house grew quiet again and she was left alone, she could not resist. She uncovered it once more, running her hands over its surface, trying to understand. She thought about the garage sale she planned to hold. The neighbors would come, curious and cheerful, ready to dig through her belongings in search of bargains. Would anyone there recognize the object for what it was? Or would they dismiss it as junk, laughing at its outdated design? The thought made her stomach twist. She could not afford to make a mistake. If this machine had any value at all, she needed to find the right person to see it. But who? She had no connections, no friends with knowledge of technology or antiques. Her husband had been the one with the curiosity for such things, and now he was gone. Yet, even in her uncertainty, she made her decision. The machine would be included in the sale. She could not afford to let it sit gathering dust while she struggled to pay for bread and milk. Whether it fetched $50 or $100, it would be more than she had now. And if no one wanted it, then perhaps she could take it into town and ask one of the second-hand shops to look at it. One way or another, it would serve its purpose. That evening, she carried the machine into the garage, where she had already begun arranging items for the sale. Stacks of books waited on one table, a jumble of pots and pans on another. Old clothing hung from a makeshift rack, their colors faded but still serviceable. She set the machine apart, resting it on its own table with the cloth folded neatly beneath it. For a moment, she stood back and studied the scene. Everything looked ordinary, the remnants of a household that had seen better days, yet the machine seemed to draw the eye, as though it did not belong among such mundane company. Her chest tightened with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, whether it would be another day of disappointment or the beginning of something new. All she knew was that her husband had left her this strange object, hidden away in the dust and shadows of the attic, and now it was hers to bear. The night closed around the house once more, the garage door creaking shut as she returned inside. She moved through the darkened rooms, lighting a single lamp in the living room before settling down again. The silence pressed in, but this time it felt different. Beneath the grief and weariness, a thin thread of possibility hummed, faint but undeniable. She did not yet know what role the artifact would play in her life, but she sensed that its arrival in her hands was no accident. And so she waited, the strange machine lingering in her thoughts like a riddle. Tomorrow, the garage sale would begin, and with it, perhaps, a glimpse of the future she had almost stopped believing in. The morning of the sale arrived with a gray sky and a restless wind that seemed to stir the neighborhood awake earlier than usual. Lillian had hardly slept. She had risen before dawn, her body aching but her mind alert with nervous energy. In the garage, tables were already lined with the things she had pulled from the attic and from the corners of the house. Every object seemed to tell a story, though none of the people who might pass by would care for those stories. They would only see prices scrawled on bits of tape, bargains to be had, curiosities to carry away. She placed the books in neat stacks, their spines cracked and worn. The kitchenware rattled as she set it out, each pot and pan a dull echo of the meals she once cooked for her family when the house was full of warmth and laughter. Clothing hung limp on wire hangers, faded shirts and dresses fluttering in the draft that slipped through the open garage door. Her children's toys, the ones they had outgrown or broken, were scattered in boxes near the entrance. All of it felt like pieces of her life laid bare, and for a moment she nearly faltered, wanting to sweep it all back into the shadows. But then she remembered the bills waiting on the counter, the refrigerator nearly empty, and she forced herself to continue. The strange machine she had found in the trunk was the last to be set out. She carried it carefully from the corner of the garage to a small table she had cleared just for it. She hesitated before removing the cloth, staring at the bundled shape as though uncovering it might unleash something she was not prepared to face. Finally, she pulled the fabric away and folded it neatly beneath the machine. Its wooden casing caught what little light there was, its keys a pale row of teeth waiting to be pressed. Against the ordinary clutter of the garage, it seemed out of place, more an artifact from another world than a household item. She bent down and wrote a price on a scrap of cardboard. $50. The number looked absurdly small, but it was the best she could imagine anyone paying. She set the sign in front of the machine and stepped back, pressing her lips together. It was done. The object was now just another item for sale, no different from the chipped mugs or the stack of magazines. Neighbors began to arrive as the morning wore on. First came the older woman from 2 houses down, her arms wrapped tightly against the wind, her eyes scanning the tables with the sharpness of a seasoned bargain hunter. She picked through the clothes, muttering about sizes, and left with a bundle of pots cradled against her chest. Then came a young couple with a baby in a stroller, their laughter filling the garage as they dug through the toy box. They bought a few stuffed animals, the baby squealing at the sight of them. More people followed, men searching for tools, children drawn to the boxes of books and games, neighbors exchanging pleasantries as they browsed. Lillian stood near the entrance, answering questions, accepting small bills and coins, trying to keep her expression calm. Inside, however, she felt the humiliation of it all, the sense that she was laying her poverty bare for the world to see. Each time she handed something over, it was as though another fragment of her life slipped from her grasp. And still the machine sat untouched. People glanced at it and moved on, some pausing long enough to laugh softly at its odd design. One man shook his head, muttering that it looked like something from a science fair decades ago. Another tapped the sign with his finger, smirked at the $50 price, and walked away. Each dismissal made Lillian's chest tighten. She wondered if she had been foolish to hope anyone would take it at all. Hours passed. The wind grew colder and the tables grew lighter as more and more items were carried off. Lillian's pocket filled with small bills, enough to buy groceries for a week, maybe 2, but not nearly enough to ease the fear that clung to her. She began to think about packing up, her eyes drifting again and again to the strange machine. Then a man appeared at the entrance, different from the rest. He was tall, with a worn leather jacket and glasses that caught the weak light. His gaze swept over the tables quickly, barely pausing at the clothing or the dishes until it fell on the machine. He stopped. His entire posture shifted, his shoulders straightening, his eyes narrowing with sudden focus. Slowly, he walked forward, each step deliberate, as though he were approaching something fragile. Lillian watched him with unease. He said nothing at first, only circled the table, studying the object from every angle. His hand hovered over the keys but did not touch them. He leaned closer to read the faded emblem, his lips pressing together as if he recognized something. Finally, he turned to her, his expression guarded, and asked what she knew about it. Her heart jumped. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she knew nothing, that it had been hidden in the attic for years and she had only just found it. But something in his tone, the way he looked at the machine, made her hesitate. She heard her husband's voice in her memory, that quiet warning not to part with things too easily, and the words caught in her throat. She only shrugged and said it was something her husband had kept, that she had no use for it now. The man nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the machine. His face revealed nothing, but she sensed the weight of his interest. When he finally asked if the price was firm, her stomach twisted. Here was her chance, the very thing she had been waiting for. And yet, a part of her resisted, a small voice whispering that this was not just another object to sell. Something about the machine demanded more caution, more respect. She looked down at the $50 sign, then back at the man. The wind rattled the garage door, the voices of neighbors drifted in from the street, and for a long moment the world seemed to hold its breath. She thought of her husband again, of the way he had hidden the machine so carefully, the way he had never spoken of it. Perhaps he had meant for her to find it one day, but surely not to give it away for so little. Her hands trembled as she reached out and lifted the sign from the table. The man frowned, confused, as she folded the cardboard in half and set it aside. She told him softly that she was not ready to sell it after all. The machine would not leave the garage that day. The man studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, then gave a curt nod and walked away. Lillian exhaled shakily, her heart pounding in her chest. She did not know why she had refused, only that she could not let it go so easily. She covered the machine with the cloth once more, her fingers pressing against the fabric as though sealing it against the world. By the end of the afternoon, most of the other items had been sold or packed away. The garage was nearly empty, the tables bare, the echoes of chatter replaced by silence. Lillian stood alone, clutching the few bills she had earned, and glanced once more at the covered machine. Her decision weighed heavily on her, but beneath the uncertainty was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, hope, perhaps even destiny. She closed the garage door slowly, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. The day had given her only small comforts, enough money to scrape by a little longer, but it had also left her with a choice that would shape everything that came next. The mysterious artifact was hers still, and she knew deep down that it carried more than dust and age. Whatever secret her husband had guarded in that trunk, it was not meant to be given away for pennies. As evening settled in, she lit a lamp and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folded bills in her hand. They felt light, almost insubstantial compared to the burden of the machine still waiting in the garage. And in that quiet moment, she understood that her journey into the attic had only just begun. The real discovery was still ahead, hidden within the strange artifact that her husband had left behind. That night, long after the garage door had been closed and the last of the neighbors had gone home, Lillian lay awake in her bed with the sound of the wind pressing against the windows. The money she had earned from the sale was tucked inside a jar on the kitchen shelf, but the sight of it brought her little comfort. The bills were few, just enough to scrape through the coming week, and the thought of facing another round of demands from the utility company made her chest tighten. What troubled her most, however, was not the insufficiency of the money, but the decision she had made about the strange machine. She could not stop thinking of the man in the leather jacket, the way his eyes had lingered on the wooden box, his cautious questions, his disappointment when she pulled the sign away. He had wanted it badly, and that alone told her there was something she did not understand. As she turned restlessly beneath the quilt, memories of her husband drifted back unbidden. She saw him carrying dusty boxes down from the attic, his shirt clinging to his skin with sweat, his eyes flickering with that secretive gleam he sometimes wore. When she asked him what he was doing, he would shrug it off, saying only that he was putting something away. At the time, she had thought little of it, too caught up in the demands of life, but now the memory struck her differently. Perhaps he had not been hiding clutter at all. Perhaps he had been preserving something he believed was valuable, something meant for another time. Sleep finally overtook her, though it was troubled and shallow. When morning came, she rose with heavy eyes and a gnawing sense of unfinished business. The machine still sat in the garage, covered neatly with its cloth, as though waiting for her. She stood before it for a long moment, her fingers tightening and loosening at her sides. She could not keep it in the shadows forever, not when the memory of the man's gaze kept circling in her thoughts. It deserved to be understood, even if she feared what the answer might be. She made her way into town, carrying the machine carefully in her arms, wrapped once again in its protective covering. The streets were busy with the hum of late-morning traffic, cars honking at intersections, people moving briskly along the sidewalks. She kept her eyes down, feeling almost ashamed to be carrying such a strange burden, but she did not stop until she reached the small antique shop on the corner of Main Street. The bell over the door chimed softly as she stepped inside, releasing the scent of old paper, wood polish, and dust. The shop was a labyrinth of forgotten eras. Shelves bowed beneath the weight of porcelain figurines, books with cracked leather bindings, glass cases filled with coins and jewelry. Lamps cast pools of amber light over the clutter, and the air was thick with a hush of secrets too old to speak. Behind the counter stood an older man with thinning hair and spectacles that magnified his eyes. He greeted her politely, but his attention sharpened when she placed the covered object on the counter. With hesitant hands, she pulled away the cloth. The man's eyes widened, his breath catching in a soundless exhale. He leaned closer, adjusting his glasses, and ran his fingers just above the surface of the machine, not daring to touch it outright. His lips moved as though forming words, but nothing emerged until at last he whispered, almost reverently, "Apple Y." Lillian felt a jolt run through her. The words meant nothing to her, yet the weight in his voice made them sound like an incantation. She asked him what it was, and his gaze flicked up to her with disbelief, as though she had just placed a chest of gold on his counter and did not recognize its worth. Slowly, patiently, he explained. The Apple Y was one of the very first personal computers ever made, built in 1976 by men whose names were now spoken with reverence in the world of technology. Only a small number had ever been produced, and even fewer had survived intact. Each surviving unit was considered a treasure, sought after by collectors around the world. Her heart pounded as she listened, the room seeming to tilt around her. She remembered the $50 sign she had set before it at the garage sale, the laughter of the passers-by who dismissed it as junk. She remembered the man in the leather jacket, the hunger in his eyes. And now she realized how close she had come to throwing away something priceless. She steadied herself against the counter, her breath shallow, as the dealer continued to speak of auctions where such machines had sold for hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars. She struggled to comprehend it. This box of wood and wires, this relic hidden away in the shadows of her attic, could be worth more than every dollar she had ever held in her life. The enormity of it pressed down on her, mingling with disbelief. She asked if he was certain, and he nodded gravely. He told her that he could make calls, connect her with experts who would authenticate it, prepare it for auction. He spoke with the calm authority of one who had seen treasures before, but even he seemed awed by what lay on the counter between them. Lillian left the shop in a daze, the machine carefully returned to its covering and cradled in her arms. The world outside seemed brighter, sharper, as though she were seeing it for the first time. Every step felt heavier, laden with the knowledge of what she now possessed. She walked home with her thoughts tumbling in chaos. Relief clashed with fear. Hope fought with doubt. If what the man had said was true, then the machine could change everything. It could save her home, secure her children's future, free her from the endless weight of debt. But the very magnitude of it frightened her. She had never held power of such scale before, and it left her unsteady. At home, she set the machine back on the kitchen table and sat staring at it for what felt like hours. The silence of the house pressed in, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. She thought of her husband again, of the care with which he had hidden the object, of the choice he had made to keep it from her. Had he known what it was worth? Had he hoped she would one day find it and be saved by it? Or had it simply been another curiosity to him, something he valued without truly understanding? She would never know. But she felt certain of one thing. He had left her more than grief. He had left her the possibility of a new life. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparations. The dealer from the shop arranged for experts to examine the machine, their eyes lighting up with the same reverence as his. They confirmed its authenticity, tracing its serial number back to the original batch assembled nearly 50 years ago. They explained that its condition, still intact and accompanied by original documentation, made it one of the rarest finds imaginable. Their words swirled around her like a dream she could not quite believe. At night, she lay awake imagining the auction. She saw herself in a grand hall, strangers in suits raising paddles, numbers climbing higher and higher until the final gavel fell. She imagined the check in her hand, the debts disappearing, the lights in her home burning bright again. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream not only of survival, but of freedom. Yet fear remained. What if it failed to sell? What if it was damaged or lost or stolen before it could reach the auction block? Each possibility haunted her, and she found herself guarding the machine as though it were a child. She kept it wrapped carefully in cloth, hidden away when she was not watching it, her heart quickening whenever she thought of a stranger's hands touching it. But beneath the fear was something stronger, something she had not felt since her husband's death. It was the stirring of hope, fragile but insistent, whispering that her life was not yet finished, that she still had a chance. The machine had waited in the dust of the attic for decades, waiting for her to uncover it. Now it was hers to carry forward, a bridge from the sorrow of the past to the possibility of the future. She looked around the dim kitchen, at the bills still stacked on the counter, at the faded curtains and cracked linoleum floor, and felt a shift within her. She was no longer only a widow drowning in debt and despair. She was the guardian of something extraordinary, something that could change the course of her life. She did not yet know how it would unfold, but she knew one truth with certainty. Her husband's secret had become her salvation, and soon the world would know it too. The weeks that followed moved with a strange mixture of slowness and breathless speed, as though time itself did not know how to behave under the weight of such a secret. Lillian found herself in a world she had never imagined entering, drawn into conversations with men and women who spoke of provenance, authentication, and estimated values in numbers so large they seemed unreal. The dealer from the antique shop had kept his promise, connecting her with experts who arrived in neat suits, carrying cases filled with instruments for examining and cataloging the machine. They treated the artifact with the same reverence one might reserve for a sacred relic, their voices hushed, their eyes bright as they recorded every detail. Lillian sat quietly during those visits, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, feeling like an intruder in her own home. Each time they confirmed its authenticity, each time they spoke of its rarity, the figures they whispered made her head spin. Millions, they said, not thousands. More than she could ever have dreamed of holding in her lifetime. She would sit at the kitchen table afterward, staring at the familiar walls of her house, and feel the enormity pressing against the ordinary fabric of her life. The peeling paint, the sagging curtains, the stack of unpaid bills, all of it might soon vanish into the past, replaced by a future she could barely imagine. When the day of the auction finally came, she felt as though she were walking into another life. The building was grand, its stone facade towering above the street, polished doors opening into a hall that glowed with chandeliers. She had never been in such a place before. Her clothes were plain, her shoes scuffed from years of wear, and she felt keenly the eyes of people dressed in silks and tailored jackets as they moved around her with easy confidence. For a moment, she thought she did not belong, that she had stumbled into a theater where she did not know the lines of the play. But then she remembered her husband, remembered the secret he had left her, and lifted her chin. She had come to see his hidden treasure find its true place in the world. The auctioneer greeted her with the practiced politeness of a man accustomed to wealth and rarity, his voice smooth, his gestures precise. He assured her that the machine was secure, displayed for the bidders in a glass case that stood beneath the bright lights at the front of the hall. When she glimpsed it there, she hardly recognized it. Polished, carefully presented, it no longer looked like the dusty relic she had carried down from the attic. It looked important, commanding, a piece of history. She felt a flicker of pride, as though her husband's secret had transformed into a crown jewel before her eyes. The hall filled with people, their conversations blending into a low hum of anticipation. Lillian sat near the back, clutching her hands together, her heart thudding so loudly she was sure others could hear it. She had never been in such a crowd, never felt so small among so many who carried themselves with the easy assurance of money. Yet she knew that, in a way, she held more power than any of them. The object they all desired belonged to her, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt a spark of control over her life. The auction began with other items, each introduced with flourish and sold for sums that left her stunned. Paintings, jewelry, rare manuscripts, objects that once would have seemed impossible luxuries to her, now passing under the hammer with practiced ease. She hardly listened, her mind fixed on the moment when her husband's machine would be brought forward. At last, the auctioneer raised his gavel and announced the next lot. A fully authenticated Apple I computer, one of the very first personal computers ever produced, preserved in remarkable condition with original documentation. The murmurs in the hall grew sharper, more focused, as attendants wheeled the glass case forward. Lillian's breath caught in her throat as the light shone down upon it, gleaming against the polished wood, the faded emblem glowing like a relic of prophecy. The bidding began. The auctioneer's voice rang out with the opening price, already higher than any sum Lillian had ever dared imagine. Hands lifted almost immediately, paddles rising with calm certainty. The numbers climbed quickly, the rhythm of the bids like the pounding of her heart. 100,000, 200, 4, 6. The figures leapt higher, the auctioneer's voice growing more rapid, more animated as the contest intensified. Lillian sat frozen, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the machine as though afraid it might vanish if she looked away. Around her, the wealthy raised their paddles with the ease of people bidding for amusement. Yet, she knew that each number meant a transformation of her life. When the price crossed $1 million, she pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Never had she believed that such a number could be tied to her existence. Never had she dared to dream of such freedom. The battle narrowed to a few determined bidders, their faces stern, their voices carrying as they signaled their intent. The auctioneer's chant rose and fell, the rhythm like a drumbeat driving the moment toward climax. 1.8 million, 2 million, 2.1. Lillian felt dizzy, gripping the edge of her chair as though the world itself might tilt. And then, as the tension reached its peak, the final bid rang out. $2.3 million. The hall erupted with murmurs, the sound of awe and approval washing through the room like a tide. The auctioneer struck his gavel down, the sound echoing like thunder. Sold. The word rang in Lillian's ears, final and absolute. She sat back in her chair, her vision blurring with tears. It was done. The secret her husband had left hidden in the dust of the attic had become her salvation. The machine would leave her hands, carried off into the world of collectors and museums, but in return it had given her something priceless, a future. As the attendants secured the artifact and the bidders settled back into their seats, Lillian rose quietly, her legs trembling. The hall spun with voices, but she moved as though in a dream, following the auctioneer's assistant to a side office where the paperwork would be completed. There, amid the polished desks and the murmur of clerks, she was handed documents confirming the sale, and at last a check that bore more zeros than she had ever thought possible. She held it in her hands, staring down at the numbers, her breath catching in her throat. In that moment, the weight of years seemed to lift from her shoulders. The debts that had haunted her, the fear that had hollowed her, the endless nights of despair. All of it was banished by the promise contained in that piece of paper. She thought of her children, of the home she could now preserve for them, of the chance to give them education and stability. She thought of her husband, of the care he had taken to guard the machine, and whispered her thanks to him through her tears. When she left the building, the evening air was cool and crisp, the city lights glowing against the deepening sky. She walked slowly, the check clutched in her hand, each step heavier with the enormity of what had just passed. For the first time since his death, she felt something beyond grief. She felt the shape of hope, real and solid, pressing into her heart. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk, no longer bound by despair. The machine had waited for decades in the dust of the attic, carrying within it the power to alter her destiny. Now, through her husband's hidden legacy, she carried the future in her hands. When Lillian returned home from the city, the house seemed different to her eyes, though nothing had changed in her absence. The same worn curtains hung over the windows, the same tired paint lined the walls, the same stack of bills sat waiting on the counter. Yet, the air itself felt lighter, as though the shadows that had haunted these rooms for so long had been dispelled. She stood for a long time in the doorway, holding her bag close, feeling the quiet press against her, and for the first time it was not the suffocating silence of grief, but a calmness, like a deep breath after a storm. She placed the check on the kitchen table and sat in the chair where she had spent so many nights staring at numbers she could not pay, wondering how she would ever survive. Now on that same table lay a promise larger than she had ever dared to imagine. She rested her hand lightly on the slip of paper, half afraid it might vanish if she pressed too hard, half afraid she might wake to find it was only a dream. But the ink was real, the weight of it undeniable, and with it came a certainty that her life was no longer bound by despair. The following days unfolded with a clarity she had not known in years. She went to the bank, her hands trembling as she passed the check across the counter, the teller's polite smile giving no hint of the magnitude of what had just transpired. When the funds were confirmed and secured, Lillian felt a warmth spread through her chest, a warmth that grew brighter with each passing hour. She settled her debts one by one, watching the burdens that had clung to her fall away like chains unfastened. The phone calls stopped, the threats of disconnection ceased, and in their place came a stillness she could savor without fear. With her obligations met, she turned to the home itself. The house that had sagged beneath the weight of years seemed to lift as workers arrived to repair its bones. Cracks were mended, walls painted fresh, the roof sealed against the weather. New curtains replaced the faded ones, catching the light of the morning sun. The creak of the stairs remained, but now it sounded less like a lament and more like the heartbeat of a house alive again. In the evenings, she would walk through each room, breathing in the scent of new paint and polished wood, and feel her husband's presence not as a shadow, but as a quiet blessing. Her children, too, felt the change. Their eyes, once dulled by worry, now lit with the brightness of possibility. They laughed more freely, their steps lighter as they returned from school to a home that no longer echoed with fear. She opened a savings account in their names, whispering promises of education, of doors opening where once only walls had stood. For the first time, she could speak of the future without hesitation. And when she looked into their faces, she saw hope reflected back at her. Yet, amid the renewal, Lillian found herself drawn often to the memory of the machine. It was gone now, carried away into the world of collectors and curators, but its presence lingered in her heart. She would sit at the kitchen table in the quiet of night and think of the attic, of the moment she pulled away the cloth to see the faded emblem gleaming through the dust. She thought of her husband, of the care with which he had hidden it, of the choice he had made never to tell her. She wondered if he had known what it was worth, if he had imagined this moment when it would save her. Perhaps he had only loved it for what it was, a relic of innovation, a piece of history. Or perhaps, in some unspoken way, he had always intended for her to find it when she needed it most. In those moments, she spoke to him softly, her voice no more than a whisper in the dark. She thanked him for the life he had given her, for the strength he had left behind, for the strange gift that had carried her from despair to hope. She told him that she had kept her promise to the children, that the house was safe, that their future was bright. She told him that though she missed him with every breath, she no longer felt lost because he had given her a path forward. The seasons began to change, winter fading into spring, and with it the world outside seemed to mirror her renewal. Blossoms lined the trees along the street, their colors vivid against the pale sky, and birds sang in the mornings when she opened the windows to let in the air. She tended to the small garden at the back of the house, planting flowers where weeds had once ruled, her hands deep in the soil, her heart steady. The earth yielded to her touch, and in its growth she saw a reflection of her own rebirth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, she stepped out into the yard and stood watching the horizon. The house behind her glowed with light, the laughter of her children spilling from the windows. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of the fading day on her skin. The weight of grief was still there, for loss never truly vanished, but it no longer crushed her. Instead, it rested in her like a stone at the bottom of a river, heavy but settled, softened by the flow of life above it. She opened her eyes and gazed upward, the first stars emerging in the deepening sky. A smile touched her lips, small but sure, and she whispered again into the quiet, thanking her husband not only for the gift of the machine, but for the reminder that even in the darkest corners, hope could be found. She knew now that her life was not defined by loss, but by resilience. Not by what she had lost, but by what she still carried forward. As night settled over the neighborhood, Lillian returned to the house, the warm glow spilling out to meet her. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and felt the embrace of home wrap around her like a long-awaited comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, but she no longer feared them. She had been to the edge of despair and had found her way back. She had discovered, in the dust of the attic, a bridge to a new life. And as she sat at the kitchen table, listening to the laughter of her children and the hum of a house restored, she realized that the greatest treasure her husband had left her was not the machine itself, nor the wealth it had brought, but the strength to rise from sorrow and begin again. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss our next unbelievable stories. We've got more shocking discoveries and life-changing secrets waiting for you in our upcoming videos. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Click right now to watch our other videos packed with twists you never saw coming. And share this video with your friends and family.